Hi, live from Studio 6B. Welcome back to the show. More news, more sports, a little more entertainment coming up. But right now, Dr. Walter E. Williams is currently the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He's a syndicated columnist, author of numerous books. His new column is entitled Insults to Black History, and he joins us on the show today, and it is my absolute honor to have him on the show. Dr. Walter E. Williams, how are you, sir?
Okay, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's really, truly an honor to have you on the show, especially at this time, what's going on in the country. But I want to start with this. I want our audience to hear from you. What is your definition of liberty? And then past that, my second question to that is, could you discuss what we're seeing right now in the country as different groups of people seem to be, in essence, using liberty to almost try and destroy liberty? Give me your thoughts on both of those.
Well, I think that maybe a working definition of liberty is when people are allowed to pursue their own ends, so long as they do not violate the rights of others to pursue their own ends. And one of the requirements for liberty is limited government. But unfortunately, it's sad for me to say, I think that most Americans have utter contempt for personal liberty.
Yeah. So what we're seeing around the country right now, this was kind of my follow-up to that. It seems like obviously we're seeing this woke mob of tearing down statues and rioting and protesting, some peaceful, mostly not. The idea of kind of using liberty to in some ways take liberties away and destroy liberty. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. These people who are protesting in the name of, I guess the protests started in the name of George Floyd, who was, and Americans ought to be rightly upset with the killing him, but what it's turned into is just turned into mob violence, and people are taking opportunity to steal and loot and riot and destroy property, and that has nothing to do with the ideas of liberty. It has nothing to do with the First Amendment freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, and freedom of speech has absolutely nothing to do with that.
Yeah. So you wrote in a recent article, the true plight of black people has little or nothing to do with police or what has been called systemic racism. Instead, we need to look at the responsibilities of those running our big cities. And, you know, it's one of the things that really, it's never tried in the inner cities is what we've just been talking about is liberty. It's never tried in these neighborhoods, you know, in these poor communities. We have a massive middle class in this country. We have people who have come out of poverty, have done extremely well. We have rich people, poor people. But the common thread that allows for success is liberty, not socialism, not one-party rule that we see in so many of these cities. Isn't that correct?
You're absolutely right. And the cities where a large percentage of black Americans are facing the most difficult problems, whether it's safety or whether it's education, whether it's housing, are in the very cities where Democrats have been running the entire city for well over a half a century. And very often, the Democrats who run it are black mayors, black chief of the police, black superintendent of schools. But at the same time, you find it, let's say, like in the city of Baltimore, it's been run by blacks for decades. And it turns out, like in 13 of the 39 high schools, not a single student tests proficient in math, and only 3% in reading. And that story can be told all over the country, whether you're talking about Philadelphia, whether you're talking about Detroit, Chicago. And then another major problem, people are focusing on police when, let's say, in Chicago, just this last weekend, 104 people were shot, and I believe it was 18 were murdered. And it turns out this year so far, close to 300 people in Chicago have been murdered, and most of them blacks by blacks, and the policemen have shot 3 people. And so I think it's kind of a waste of resources if you're concerned about black lives to focus all of your energy and attention on police.
Yeah. I think it's so important for the audience to be hearing from someone like yourself, because we're hearing now in the nomenclature and it's becoming just almost secondhand for everybody to be yelling systemic racism like it's in the DNA of the country. We must eliminate systemic racism, we keep hearing. But nobody knows what that means, and it almost doesn't seem to matter. It's like saying we have to eliminate income inequality and we have to achieve environmental justice. It's just the left seems to, there's no measure there, there's nothing to be measured by any standards, like how many kids graduate from the schools they control or the criminal rates in the towns they control, like what you've been saying.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and what we hear, a lot of the nonsense that we hear today, comes from college campuses where professors indoctrinate students to this idea of white privilege and systemic racism, institutional racism. But I think that, as I said in this week's column, I think that many Americans do not realize, and also Black Americans do not realize that that Black Americans as a group have made the greatest gains over some of the highest hurdles in the shortest period of time than any other racial group in the history of mankind. And you say, well, Williams, what's the evidence? Well, if you add up the income that Black Americans earn each year, and just thought of Black Americans as a separate country, we would be clearly within the top 20 richest countries on the face of this earth. It was a Black American who was the head of the world's mightiest military, Colin Powell. There are few Black Americans that are billionaires. They're Black Americans are some of the most famous world personalities, and there was a Black American, half Black American, who was president of the United States. Now, the significance of all this is that in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, neither a slave nor a slave owner would have believed that this kind of progress was possible in a little bit over a century, or close to a century and a half. And as such, it speaks to the intestinal fortitude of a people, but just as importantly, it speaks to the greatness of a nation where these gains were possible. That is, these kind of gains would not have been possible anywhere on the face of this earth except in the United States of America. And now that doesn't mean that all Black problems are solved. There's a large percentage of Black people, 25, 30%, for whom these gains have been elusive. And so what we need to do, we need to focus on why the gains have not filtered down to these people. And I think that the major reason is the welfare state.
Yes, we're speaking with Walter Williams. Of course, he is the professor of economics at George Mason University, and he's just talking about his new, most recent article that's out, Walter E. Williams' column, Insults to Black History. And to pick up where you left off, you've talked about the welfare state, and you've said that it's done more damage to Black communities than Jim Crow and slavery ever could have dreamed of doing. Explain that in some detail for the audience.
That is absolutely right. There's evidence, and part of it's from a sociologist, Herbert Gutman, wrote a number of years ago about the Black family, and he pointed out that more Black kids lived in two-parent households during slavery than live now. The illegitimacy rate among Blacks is right now around 75%. In 1940, it was 11% or 12%. And matter of fact, for whites, it was 3% in 1940, and now it's over 30%. And the Black families, if you look in New York and New York City, 1925. The 95% of kids lived in two-parent families. I doubt whether you can find 15% today. And so those people who would argue that the decline or the breakdown of the Black family is a result of the legacy of slavery, discrimination, and all this stuff, it's just plain nonsense, because Blacks had far greater stability during earlier periods when we were far closer to slavery. And if you look at my book, I have written a book a few years ago. It's called Race and Economics, and I point out in various cities that the Black family structure was very similar to all other family structures: Polish Americans, Italian Americans, and Chinese Americans. Roughly 80% of kids living in two-parent families.
Yeah, one of the other very important things we've talked about in the show, and I really would want to hear your opinion on this. We see a lot of sports figures, a lot of actors, even journalists who embrace this hate America ideology, whether they do it wittingly or unwittingly. They seek to undermine basically all the foundational institutions of the society, and they basically have no desire to promote serious change. None of these sports figures like LeBron James, they never live in these communities that they supposedly speak for. They don't send their kids to the schools in these communities that they supposedly speak for. They may go back on Thanksgiving and donate a turkey or set up a foundation, but none of them have a direct, they're not invested as community members buying houses in these communities. What do you think about all these sports figures, the kneeling and all of that?
Well, you might add to them congressmen and political figures who are mayors and chief of police and superintendent of schools. They don't have their kids going to these grossly rotten schools. They send their kids to private schools or parochial schools. Matter of fact, there's a study done some years ago, and it showed that public school teachers send their kids to private schools more often than the public at large. And these people, these sports figures that you mentioned, they maybe they grew up in some of these poor neighborhoods, but they damn sure don't live in these poor neighborhoods anymore, and they're just playing the game. They're not making any particular sacrifice. And matter of fact, I don't expect for them to make a sacrifice. That is the best thing that people can do for any race is to do the best that they can at what they do. For example, I'm 84 years old, and I remember when Joe Louis, he didn't get on a soapbox. He didn't do anything. He was just as damn good. He was the best that he could possibly be in boxing, and that meant a whole lot to black people in the late 30s and early 40s in terms of the self-respect that we gained from his achievement and achievement of Jackie Robinson, Don Newcomb, and all those other guys. They weren't on a soapbox. They were just trying to be the best at doing whatever they do.
Yeah. And what's amazing is I had Rudy Giuliani on the show, and we talked about this, and he said, no place did I get more women, mothers coming up to me and saying, please send more police, keep them here, was than in the black communities. And we played a video on the show tonight of Amy Horowitz going into Harlem, into Brooklyn, and asking white people about the police, and you get the answer of saying, "Oh, get rid of them." The black community would be so much better without them. Then he goes into Harlem and asks African Americans about it, and they go, "Oh no, we want them here. We need more. It would be a disaster without them." So, talk to me about the difference in how white and black people view the police in their own neighborhoods.
Well, I think the point that needs to be stressed is that poor people, low-income people, their best defense is law and order. That is, they depend heavily on a orderly society. Now, wealthy people, if things get bad, they can afford to have alarm system, hire guards, or have a dog, and eventually, if things get too bad, move away to a gated community. But for poor people, the only thing that stands between them and tragedy is an orderly society. That is, namely, law and order. That is, poor people depend on law and order more so than anybody else, because that's all they have going for them. They don't have enough money to hire guards, go to gated communities, get dogs, alarm systems, things like that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Walter E. Williams, it is truly an honor to have you on the show. It's such an important time in our history, and I want to just say I thank you for being such an important voice. You are an American treasure and keeping us educated on these issues, and it's been an honor to have you on the show, and hopefully we can do it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, Dr. Walter E. Williams here, live from Studio 6B. We're back right after this.